Okay, in this video I'm going to walk through our RhoMobile 4.0 Barcode API for JavaScript. So right now the current version is in beta, but wanted to walk through some of the code on how to use this API. So right now looking at our docs for this API, edgedocs.rhomobile.com, and just a general note about our JavaScript APIs. The JavaScript APIs require two things, and it's covered in the documentation. If you look at the APIs, you'll see that certain APIs fall under the categories of different extensions. Some are already included if you specify app type as row elements. And the other aspect is to actually be able to generate and link to the proper JavaScript API file. So if you look at the API documentation, you'll see this JavaScript usage guide, which we'll go through. But the important thing here is that in your application, you're going to need to include this RhoAPI-modules.javascript. Okay, this file is generated dynamically when you build your application, and it will build depending on what you have in your build.yaml settings for extensions and capabilities, and it will customize the JavaScript file for the extensions that you plan on using in your application. And it's also platform specific. So when you build for Android, it'll build a RhoAPI modules.js file for Android. Okay. Now you'll see this reference /public/API. When you install your APK, let's say for example in Android, this file will be there for your application that's running on the local web server. You may also see this particular path and file when you look at your your project in RhoStudio. You may see this folder generated, and you will see it if you've generated the API using a command line that we have, or if you've actually tried to run against RhoSimulator. So just be careful, because this file is generated dynamically for each platform. Okay, so those are the two things you need. Is you need to have reference to this JavaScript file, and you also need to have the right extension. Let me go back to Barcode for a minute. Now, Barcode in RhoMobile 4.0 is a combination of, we had two APIs that kind of did the same thing previously in 2.2. One was called Scanner, and one was called Barcode. So this is a combination of those two. There are certain features in the Barcode API that come from the previous Scanner class that was really targeted for Motorola specific devices, Motorola Solutions devices. And you'll see reference to those if we look at one particular method. Let's look at enable. You'll see it for Barcode enable that that there's an indicator here that it runs on Android, runs on Windows Mobile, and it's also this particular method is available only for Motorola Solutions devices. So just be careful of that. There's some APIs that are targeted toward take advantage of Motorola Solutions SDKs, and will give you different functionality. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples, walking through my project setup, and then just go through some simple code. So let's jump into RhoStudio. I've just generated a basic example, and for this case, I'm demonstrating JavaScript. So I'm not going to really use my layout.erb. I am actually just using it to quickly launch my individual examples. So you'll notice that I'm just kind of using index.erb to point to my HTML file. So let's take a look at. We'll go through the first example. Barcode enumerate. So I'm in my public folder, and I have Barcode enumerate open here, and you can see that I'm just using a bare bones HTML structure here, your typical HTML structure. Here's the key, all right? I am pulling in this case, I'm referencing public API, RhoAPI modules. You need to have this in order for our JavaScript objects to be recognized. I'm also calling this before any jQuery syntax. So you're going to want to make sure that not jQuery syntax, jQuery libraries, I'm sorry. You want to make sure that you pull in your RhoAPI file before any jQuery mobile. You don't need to have this. I'm just using it for my selectors and just easy manipulation. So this is the whole file here. All it does, let's kind of walk through it. There's a button that's in the body, and it's going to call the enumerate scanners function. Inside that function, we're really just doing this simple rho.barcode. So all of our APIs you need to preference with rho dot. And I'll get into some other aspects on how you can actually avoid doing that using your own instance objects. But for this simple example, I'm just going to call the default object called rho.barcode, and I'm going to call enumerate. So if we jump back to the documentation, we will see that if I go to the enumerate method, you'll number one see this is a class method, and you'll see that barcode.enumerate takes in one parameter. It takes in this callback handler, and this is a special parameter that we have in the documentation to indicate that you can put in a callback here. If I look at the parameters tab, it'll show more information about the types and if it's optional or not. I can see in this case that this is optional. I don't need to call it, and if I don't call it, it's going to return, or if I have a callback or if I don't have a callback, it's going to return an array, and it's going to return an array of objects, and the objects are of type barcode. So basically when I call this, I'm going to get back an array of barcode objects, these actual objects where I can then use the methods and properties for this particular object because I'll have a barcode object. Okay. So let's look at the example, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the callback handling. We'll actually show some different ways you can do this. Okay, so in this case, I'm actually not using a callback. I'm actually just returning the array. So when I come back from rho.barcodeEnumerate, my scanners variable here will just be an array of objects, and then I'm practically just looping through the array of scanners, and I'm assigning a new variable called scanner, which is the instance of the barcode object instance for this particular item in the array. And then here's where I'm pulling in some more APIs. So now that I know that my scanner variable is of type barcode, I can look at the properties for barcode. And in this case, I'm just going to display the scanner type and the friendly name. So where did I get that from? Well, let's take a look. Again, remember that this object here, scanner, is a barcode object. So now I have access to all the properties. I decided to just pick scanner type, okay, which will tell you camera, imager, laser, and also the friendly name, which is something that is displayed or from our legacy RhoElements APIs available on Motorola devices only. Okay, so I'm just pulling in those and using those, and I just display them in the list. So let's go ahead and run this. I have this already installed on my MC40. So and this is Android. So let's go ahead and launch it. You'll see, and actually, you know what? I forgot to mention one thing. Before we go ahead and run it, let me just show you my build.yaml, because you notice that I showed RhoElements application. So I chose to basically say app type RhoElements. And why did I do that? Well, if I look at the barcode API, you'll see that it requires either extension barcode or app type RhoElements. If you decide to just have extension barcode, you can still access the APIs for the barcode object. On Windows Mobile, you'll need to make sure that you also include that we're using the Motorola WebKit or the Motorola browser in your capabilities list. And on Android, it's actually going to be running on the native browser for 4.0. So that's a change from previous versions that you should note in the migration guide. But anyway, let me jump back to my example here. I have app type as row elements, and I built the application. So let's go to the application, and I'm going to click on enumerate. Now remember, this was just the index.erb. Oops, I did a fat finger. Let me click on enumerate again. So that was the index.erb. This is pulling this barcode.enumerate code. Okay, so when I click on the button, it's going to execute the JavaScript here and get an array and just add these to the list there. So we'll see that here's the scanner type and here's the friendly name that's displayed in the list. And that's just a very simple example. So now let's introduce another concept. I talked a little bit about an instance object. So let's go and look at this particular example. Same bare bones instructions, same APIs. The only thing I'm doing is, in this case, I'm actually calling a method called barcode.getDefault, and this is going to return the default object. So in this case, I'm actually saving an instance variable. In the past, in version 2.2 of RhoElements and RhoMobile, we didn't really, for JavaScript at least, we didn't support these instance objects. You always had to use our global, namespace, right, the object space. So now you can actually, if you wanted to, in this case, I'm going to save a reference to the scanner that I want to use. I'm still going to go through that same enumerate, but this time, if I say, oh, look at the friendly name, if the friendly name is the camera scanner, I will actually say, okay, my scanner, I want to use the camera scanner for whatever reason as my scanner, okay? And I'm just showing you the difference here in actually using this API in the application. So I have two buttons, one calling barcode enable and one calling the barcode enable of my scanner instance. So and both of these are relatively the same thing. If I look at barcode enable my scanner, okay, I am just going to reference my scanner.enable, okay, which we haven't showed you, and I'll cover the enable in a second. But if I just look at my scanner, I can use that as a barcode object. And if I call enable default, barcode enable, let me go to that function, you can see that I'm just using the object space, row.barcode. So this will use the default scanner. Okay, now this one will use the camera, and the reason why is because I saved reference to it when the page loaded, and it actually saved a reference to the object. So let's go ahead and run that, and we can kind of show what's happening there. So let me go back. Here's the enumerate with instance. Okay, so now it's enumerated, and it's essentially set my scanner to be the camera scanner. So if I enable my scanner, I should see the camera come up, which I do. And the camera is being used. If I click enable default and I push the scan button on the device, it's now back to the laser scanner, which is you can't really see in the video. Okay, so that's saving an instance. You'll see in the documentation, if I look at the enable, the enable method, you'll see the access tab, and most of our APIs support instance methods and the default instance. Some do not, so you'll need to make sure when you check if you're allowed to do an instance method. Okay, and when you look at this, you can see that if you don't see any instance methods here listed in the documentation, you need to just do the class instance instead. Okay, so that's instances. One of the things that you saw in the code was the enable function. So let's take a look at the enable function again. So in this case, I am actually, there's another example. Same type of code was just used in the instance example, but I'm actually using Barcode enable, and instead of like before we had in the enumerate, we had the opportunity to specify a callback, but instead we just used the return values. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm actually specifying a callback. So I'm doing row.enable, and the first parameter is properties you can pass in, and then I have a callback handler, which is just an anonymous function that's defined within this row barcode enable call. So let's take a look at how I came about that. So if you look at the barcode enable, you'll see there's two parameters. There's a property map, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute, and then there's the callback, that special callback handler parameter that I mentioned before. So let's take a look at my code and just kind of compare the two. Here's the row.barcode enable, and I have the first property here is a property map, which is empty, and then a callback handler, which in this case I decided to use an anonymous function. You can also put in just a JavaScript function if you want, and that function will get executed. But I'm just following some good practice on scope with JavaScript, and I'm using an anonymous function. Now, what comes back in the anonymous function, you'll see that I have this variable called e, right? So you're gonna say, all right, what is in e? Well, let's look at the callback for a minute and go back to my documentation. And when you see a callback handler for a parameter, you will also see a tab for callback, and you'll be able to see what comes back from the callback, what type of object. Typically, it's a hash or an object, and inside that object, you'll have some properties that you'll be able to access. So you'll see data source type. So let's go back to my code and show you that I have this E, which is my callback object, okay, callback object, and I'll have these properties available to me. So if I want the data parameter, I just specify it in my E object, e.data, and it will list these properties. So you'll see I basically specify and list out all the properties that are available to me in this callback object, return object. Okay, so let's go to the example. Let me go back home here, and let's call the enable. Okay, so I'll get to the parameters in a second, but now let me do enable, which, so I just did the enable function, which is basically going to walk through this. And enable, just while we're here, is essentially for Motorola specific devices and Motorola Solutions devices that have a hardware button for scanning. So it's essentially enabling the scanning button. It doesn't emit the laser. You won't see anything really happen. It's just enabling the button. So when the button is pressed and the barcode is decoded, this callback function will get kicked off. So I have it pressed. So you're not going to be able to see this in my screenshot here, but trust me, the laser went off and I scanned the barcode, and you'll see that I'm displaying, here's the e.data, here's the source that it came from, the type, and the time and length. Okay, direction I guess is unavailable on this device. So that's essentially how to do callback handling on your API calls. And you'll see that we have a lot of methods that have these callback parameters. I could have done the same thing for my enumerate. I could have referenced a callback instead of just doing the return. You'll see it's optional, right? So be sure you pay attention, like in this case, enable. If I look at the parameters, the callback handler was also optional as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the property map for a minute. Okay, what does that property map mean? So this is kind of a special named parameter that you'll see in some cases where you can pass in a hash or an object of properties. So if I wanted to set certain properties for this barcode object, when I enabled it, I can pass in a list of properties. Now the documentation is not going to list every single property, but it's basically any property that you can specify and set properties, or that you can set, okay? So let's take a look at an example of this. So let's go to, I think it's still in this example. Yeah, barcode with enable with parameters, okay? Now, in this case, we're doing barcode.enable. Now remember, before, my code kind of looked like this, right? Now in this case, we're actually specifying a property, a hash of properties. So the format is the property name in quotes, a symbol, and also the value of the property, okay? And how did I get decode volume? Well, I looked at the decode, the properties for the barcode object, and I saw that there was decode volume. If I wanted to specify other properties as well, maybe auto enter, right? See, there's a type as well. Let's take a look at the, let's take a look at the decode volume so you can see why did I, so it's an integer, right? So that's why I picked decode volume 0 and didn't put that in quotes. If I wanted to also specify auto enter, I would do it like this, and I would say true because it's a Boolean. And what does that property do? It's going to automatically append an enter to the barcode scan. So in this case, it, may not really make sense because of it's just JavaScript. It's not in a form. But anyway, I think you get kind of the idea of how you would specify properties in a property map. Okay, so if I go back to my example, let's go back to, and I go back to, I'm sorry, I was actually in there. Let's go to the enable, and now this time we're going to enable with parameters. Now you may or may not be able to hear this, but I basically set the volume to 0, and there was no beep. Trust me, there was no beep, and the barcode was red. So that's just an example of passing in properties. Okay, the other example I have in here, which is very similar, is the take, barcode.take, which is very similar to enable. If I look at the API example, barcode.take essentially will turn the barcode on instantly so that it can scan. And this works across devices, including iOS. It's not Motorola solution specific, but essentially turns on the scanner and waits for it to scan. There's some note on here on how it behaves on Motorola Solutions devices. But in this case, we're actually, again, it's property map and callback, so very similar to enable, but the callback is returning a different data set. It's actually returning barcode and status, right? So let's take a look at my code, barcode.take, and in this case, remember, we're doing this anonymous function, and we have this E object, which is the callback return object, which there's barcode and status. Okay, so let's go to that example, and we'll run the take. Now I push the take button, and you can't see, but my barcode is being displayed automatically without me even pressing the button, and I scanned the barcode. Okay, and you can see that this is the barcode, right, and the status object. Okay, the last example is actually what we already went over, and that's the doing the instance and how to override the default. So I showed you that example already. Okay, so you can, I'm sorry, overriding default, set default. Let's take a look at that one. So the set default is we have a couple of helper functions that you'll see in a lot of the APIs: get default, set default, get properties, set properties. This is helper functions that are available to different APIs. And the set default will allow me to essentially set the default barcode object. So in this case, I'm going to initialize my scanner variable to be the default barcode. So by default, it'll get the best barcode object on there. So on my MC40, it'll get the 2D imager as the scanner engine. I'll go through and enumerate the scanners, and again, if it's, you know, if I find the camera, I'm going to say my scanner is the camera. Okay, I'm going to change the decode volume to 0. Okay, so remember, my scanner is a scanner barcode object. I'm setting its property to 0, and then I'm calling the object class set default, and I'm passing in my scanner. So if I wanted to change a whole bunch of parameters, I can essentially do that once. And what that does is this set default, it basically will change the default global object, right? So anytime, so this way I don't have to have a global reference to a variable hanging around in all of my JavaScript. Just, you know, the rest of the JavaScript code can call the default rho.barcode, and it'll use whatever you just overrode the scanner with, right? So in this case, I overrode it with the camera object. Okay, so if we run that example in the code here, you could see, let's go to override example, the override default. Now it's, remember, again, it went through and enumerated, and now it essentially overrode. So I'm still doing rho.barcode enable when I click this, but in this case, instead of having the laser come up, it's actually the camera, and you just see a black screen, but on my device, I see the actual camera. Okay, and there's the return data. So that's a way where you can actually override the default instance and have it available to the rest of the code without actually having to specify a variable. Okay, so that's just some brief examples on barcode JavaScript, and I hope you found this tutorial useful.